Hello, 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 and welcome to today's show. Before we get into a little bit of introductions, we would like to first welcome you to Manifest and Inclusion, which is a community space to think about advocacy, inclusion, and belonging. So let's get into a couple house rules and then we'll go through our introduction. So, first thing is be a good human being. If you're talking about a colleague or a coworker, we simply ask that you drop us a comment but don't use their name. We want to respect our wonderful colleagues that we have here. Next, you'll see some buttons down at the bottom, or you might be able to locate them with some accessible tools. If you enjoyed this conversation in any way, please drop us a like, a heart, a hand clap. If something that our guests say really resonates with you, drop that as well. You will see a right arrow button or be able to locate that, and that's the share button. Go ahead and share this conversation. That lets people know that these conversations are still important, that they should be happening, and moreover, anything that you've been a part of them and that you're engaging in professional development conversations. It is so important this time that we come together as community, and we're a part of these conversations that help keep pushing the conversation forward. If something resonates with you at any time, you can also use the comment box. That will allow us to see, hey, you have a question. Hey, you have a comment. And last but not least, hey, you're there listening to us. So, thank you so much for being part of our show today and being over our house rules and show overview. And we'll get into introductions. So, welcome to our conversation today, talking about tools to build effective victim advocacy and support systems and programs. My name is Lee Miles, and I am one half of the Manifesting Inclusion team. I use she and they pronouns, and I love inclusion, I love equity, and I hope to manifest this world to be a better place. I'll pass it over to my beloved and esteemed colleague, Dr. G.
Thank you so much, Lee, for that warm introduction. Now that we've returned from our winter hibernation, I'm also really happy to be back with this community and really looking forward to today's topic with two really passionate, dedicated, courageous, wise, and wonderful women. So I can't wait for us to hear from them. My pronouns are she and hers, and I am an educator, a counselor, and an advocate. A lot of my work relates to immigrant and refugee populations. And so again, we're just really happy to be here to, lift up these folks today. And we're happy to welcome you into our Manifesting Inclusion community, which includes this speaker series. It includes a book that's going to be coming out later on. It includes some presentations at conferences and live events. So please follow us if you haven't already on LinkedIn and on some other spaces where we are present. I am going to now ask Asia to introduce herself, and then we'll flip it over to Megan. So Asia, please tell us about you.
All right, that's always the hardest question when it comes to doing these panel discussions, right? But my name is Asia Evans. I usually start off my presentations by saying the Asia Evans. So I definitely encourage you all to do the same because you're one of one. I use the she series pronouns, and I am a technical assistance provider for a national nonprofit organization that centers victim advocacy. And this nonprofit organization not only centers victim advocacy when it comes to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, but they also work with folks who are victimized by various crimes, including homicide, and things of that nature. And so I got into this work while I was in undergrad and in grad school at my alma mater. And then from there, it just kind of became one of my passion projects, both personally and professionally. And it's very important for me to highlight and give a stage to the voices of folks who survive these crimes that look like me and are often not heard. And so that's why I've kind of made my way into the technical assistance field in order to help equip practitioners who are still working on campus and in that direct advocacy kind of like service to be able to bring a more culturally responsive lens to how they intervene, support, and respond to domestic violence and sexual assault.
Wonderful. And now let's welcome Megan in, if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Carbley. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to be here today. My background as an educator has been primarily working with and through student conduct processes as well as bias response and of course Title IX. So I've served in various roles within a Title IX lens in higher education, from supporting those who are affected, supporting the accused. I now serve as a Title IX coordinator and director of compliance at Elon University, but I've had the chance to be at several different schools. And my work and my passion as it relates to inclusion and equity and policy, I think is a unique one. I often get the question about, how do you do equity work when you're the compliance person? And I say most compliance work is rooted in equity, in our civil rights laws, Title VI and Title VII, Title IX. Those are the areas that I'm really passionate about. And as an educator, and my work and my research has been around talking with folks about those of us who get to do this work and support, mainly students, but also employees in higher education who experience violence, who experience bias, either at an institution or from an institution, and how we, as the folks doing that work, navigate our role as agents of an institution. So holding that tension between believing and striving to do education for the greater good, and as activism, while also being tied to the ways that institutions disenfranchise individuals. So I live in that tension all day, every day. And I love talking with folks about how we can support each other and the communities that we work with in higher education.
Great. Those of you who are listening can tell already we're going to have a fascinating conversation. So given that, as you introduced yourself, both of you kind of touched a little bit on what motivates you or why this work is important to you, let me ask you to tell us a little bit more about whether you call it victim advocacy, human advocacy, survivor advocacy, I know there's different words people might use. What does that type of advocacy mean to you? And let's start with Asia again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I think my concept of the way that I think about advocacy has definitely evolved from when I started as like a baby being interested in this field, and now kind of like going from that to direct advocacy work to now being kind of in like this middle point of doing technical assistance work. But I think for me, it means that I'm providing a platform for voices who often go unheard, right? I think a lot of times when we think of advocacy, and even for myself, right, I've been like, oh, okay, like, I'm standing up for this person. I'm making sure their voice is heard. It's very much I centered. And that is not what advocacy is. You have to take yourself out of that. You have to take your ego out of that. And that's something that I talk about in a lot of the trainings that I do. You have to give that power back to the survivor to talk about their narrative, to share their narrative, and to share what they experienced and what survivorhood looks like for them. And so for me, advocacy means I'm providing someone with a platform, right? I have the spotlight and I'm able to shine it on them so they can tell us what they need, so they can tell us how they experienced the violence that occurred or the situation that occurred. And so if I'm able to do that, then I feel good that I've met the requirements of my role. Like I have done my deed for the day and I'm good to go, right? And unfortunately, it's like never completely done because there's so many different things that folks might need depending on what actual form of violence they experience, and also how they are experienced when they are trying to get support, right? And so that's when that diversity, equity, and inclusion comes in, right? That's when that sense of belonging comes in, where we start needing to have the hard conversations about who gets to be a victim and who gets to be a survivor. And so I'm glad that Megan went ahead and touched on, the conversation about institutions and how that can play a role in the way survivors experience support and resources, because we need to be honest and take a look at, how are we perpetuating harm or further perpetuating violence within institutions if we are only saying a survivor only looks one type of way, and not just by race, ethnicity, or identities that we see, but also in the situations that they have been placed in the type of violence that they've experienced. And so for me, being able to shine a light and have conversations to educate practitioners on the fact that, like, if someone comes into you with multiple intersecting identities and they come in and they've experienced a tough situation, they've experienced sexual violence, they've experienced stalking, you're going to have to reckon with some of the identities and some of the biases that you hold in order to properly serve them and to make sure you are not further perpetuating harm to them. And so for me, that is what advocacy looks like at this moment within my role.
Thank you so much, Asia. That was really meaningful. I appreciate that. Do you want to add, Megan, what advocacy means to you?
Yeah, because unsurprisingly, in Asia, I see it as a privilege. I've had the great privilege to be one of Asia's teammates in this work, and so I want to connect to a piece that she said that really resonates with me in the role that I play, and where I'd shared with Dr. G earlier that I sometimes struggle with if I'm the right person to get asked questions about advocacy, because I understand it. So it's important to me, and I want to be in the conversations and I want to continue to learn. But I'm always so conscious of whether, if, when my presence as a Title IX representative, regardless of the role that I have, a representative of the administration, a representative of insert whatever policy, my racial identity, my gender presentation, those are all things that I'm very conscious of in these conversations, because, as Asia was saying, I can be the most inclusive person and be thinking about the ways that multiple intersecting identities are showing up for individuals and within systems, and how those systems that I am responsible for do or do not provide what victims and survivors need. And so I try to not only maintain that awareness and sensitivity to that, but also my role then in advocacy has become less direct, right? Because the person's not going to come to me for advocacy, right? I'm the person that maybe they're feeling like is making things hard for them as the administrator of a process. Instead, my role in advocacy becomes at the tables that I'm at, in the conversations and the policies that I'm literally writing, making sure that, to the best of my ability and within my scope and in consultation with other really thoughtful people, that we're making it better each time, so that advocate that I'm working with who's supporting a student says, yes, I know that this feedback is going to get to the coordinator or to the people responsible for this, and this is going to be different in the future. And so I really appreciated Asia bringing that into the picture, because I think it can be difficult to see your role in advocacy when you're not maybe directly working with the individual, the person who's been affected, and maybe even seen by them as a representative of harm that they've experienced at the hand of the institution.
So we've talked a lot about policy, and there might be some people that work inside and outside of nonprofit or higher education. But can you all give us some very tangible ways that inequities or exclusive practices exist? And then what are the implications of them? So, from a very kind of like micro level, what does this look like in the environments that you all work? And we'll start with Megan and then go back over to Asia.
Yeah, so the first example that comes to mind for me, and I work in a few policy areas. I'm actually situated within human resources, so I work with students and employees. The first one that comes to mind is around Title IX, right? So we have, in the current regulations under Title IX, schools that receive federal funding are required to provide for what's called a live hearing, and that could be on Zoom. And within that live hearing, the parties, either the person who's been accused, the person who has brought forward the complaint, they can choose any advisor, anybody they want, and that can include an attorney. And so one of the ways that we see inequity playing out within that system, right, it is through who can or cannot get access to an attorney. Right. So an attorney who might be an advisor, and the perception that an attorney advisor is better or more qualified or and more X, Y, or Z, right? And how that feels and can be intimidating to folks in the process. So we see within that one element, right? Some folks are like, yes, I can afford an attorney. I'm still feeling all of these things, but another student may also not be able to afford an attorney. And then you add race and gender, and there's probably some socioeconomic layers in there as well. And it creates a real strong sense of inequity and lack of access for some folks.
I think one of the immediate things that comes to mind on my end is something that I honestly didn't really think about too much until I started working at the nonprofit that I work at, which is language justice and accessibility. And I wasn't thinking about it because I'm privileged for English to be the language that I'm proficient in, right? To be my native language. And so when we have conversations with our grantee schools about language accessibility and then moving that into language justice, we have conversations about if someone walks into your support office, whether that's a violence response center, whether that's dean of students, whether that's Title IX, whatever the case is, if someone walks into your office and does not speak English, are they able to access help? And the answer, I'm not going to say 9 times out of 10, I'm going to say maybe like 7.5 times out of 10. The answer is no, right? And that rang true for me at my previous institution as well. And I actually had that happen, and I was like, I started buffering because I was like, wait, I don't know what to do, right? And so I think about that, and one of the extensions of like the resources that we have is a podcast, which I can talk about later, that we talk about this. But thinking about if someone cannot communicate with you what they need, how are they going to access the support and the resources that they need, right? And that further victimizes them. And the next question that I always ask is, when it comes to accessibility, how many clicks does it take to get to the sexual misconduct policy on your website? How many clicks does it take for someone to figure out, hey, let me read through this procedure. Let me read through what it means to go through a formal hearing process before I make the decision to go talk to Megan about what happened to me, right? On top of that, is it already translated into my native language? Do I have to request to have this policy translated? If so, that might take an additional 10 to 14 business days. Then I have to read it. Then I have to schedule another meeting to tell you whether I want to move forward with an informal resolution or a formal resolution. And by that point, so much time has passed between what has happened or my initial desire to want to go through a healing experience that has been that the institution can help me with. Now I don't want to do it anymore because now there are too many barriers that exist for me to get the help and support that I want, right? And so what are we saying to students who are survivors, who are already having a hard time advocating for themselves, who are already being put in a vulnerable situation? We're then having to ask them to tell us that we need to translate this policy. And you already know, then comes in the money aspect, and okay, well, we'll have to get back to you, and then we'll let you know when it's translated and we send it over to you, right? Those things that seem like admin tasks for us are very big deals for the people who have been impacted by violence. things, right? And they're very little small things for us. It's like, okay, we need to add this to our website. We have to talk to our IT person or our web designer and say we need to add another page. But that's small fish for us, big fish for someone else. And so when I think about those things that are on the more micro level, I'm thinking about some of those things that we don't think about. Or if, oh, this student has to go to the basement of the building in order to file a complaint or to receive help or to talk to the victim advocate that's on campus, right? We understand space is limited, in campus environments, or just in buildings, right? But what does that say? I have to go down into the basement. It's dark, it's cold, it looks dingy. Like, let's be real. Like, what does that say to the survivor about how they're going to initiate their healing process? That's not something that we tend to think about. And I feel like as practitioners, we're like, once again, that's small fish. But again, the message that sends to folks who are already in vulnerable spaces, it doesn't send the best message. And so I think those are two actionable things that we can think about.
Thank you both. I really appreciate the ways that you've helped shine a light on, some of the barriers that people have in accessing services. So whether those are like, I can't afford an attorney, or I don't want to go down into that scary basement, or I'm concerned people won't believe me, or I can't access the information in the language that I need it. Those barriers are all very real. And on top of the fact that many times victims of all types of violence are less likely to report to start with. It's one of the most underreported areas. And so I think attending to what we can do is so important. So that is my next question, actually, is how can we navigate these challenging barriers when we're trying to support victims? So, like, have you seen any strategies that have helped to diminish the impact of some of these barriers, or like workarounds, or ways that that people have tried to move past those challenging barriers to access? And either one of you is welcome to start on this one.
Because I'm like, I'm looking at Megan. Megan's looking at me. I'm like, okay. So, in the example that I just gave, I definitely think, taking the time to translate your policies, and to have interpretation services available for students, or clients that come in for like like campus survivors and stuff like that, is definitely something that can be done, and is something that is starting to be done more often. I think I also want to lean into, I'm kind of getting a little bit out of my scope here, but hiring practices and thinking about who's at the table in these spaces, and who's able to provide advocacy in these spaces. So I know, this field of victim advocacy work, is very, very much white dominated, very much white female dominated, historically as well. This is a field where Black women, just gonna make it plain here, Black women are not seen as victims. We were not seen as victims, right? Um, and so there's a lot of history that goes into this field, and why there's so much work that needs to be done historically and generationally, um, to serve a population within this field that is disproportionately impacted, disproportionately marginalized, and not seen as staff of this field as much as they should, right? And so when I think about ways that we can kind of try to mitigate those barriers and mitigate the lack of cultural responsiveness, because we want to move away from cultural competency, cultural responsiveness means there's an action. right? Cultural competency is, okay, I'm the wokest person in the room. I've mastered all the concepts. I'm good. I don't need to learn anymore, right? And that's not what we're trying to do. Cultural responsiveness requires you to be in a state of constant reflection and to have cultural humility and to be able to reflect on the engagement of the communities that you are serving, right? And so when we have hiring practices that allow for folks who look like the voices of the community to have a chance to be staff of this place, right, of this support center, that's great, right? And then once we have that staff in there, we need to be able to have trainings to figure out, okay, where are we not seeing engagement, and how can we fix that? How can we educate ourselves? How can we continue adding on to our knowledge about the communities that we serve, but also how are we going to be able to develop relationships with the communities that are underserved by us specifically? Because it's going to be different depending on your region, right? And so being able to have some time to get that foundational knowledge going is going to be very important. And I think it's something that is tangible that can be done. If you need help with that, holla at your girl. But I also think it's an important part of being an advocate and owning, hey, like I just said a few minutes ago, language justice and accessibility was not on my mind. I know I need to further develop that area to be a stronger advocate for survivors. And so again, being able to leave your ego at the door and take the time to embrace the areas you need to further develop and actually do so, that's very important.
I have several things that I'm thinking, but I was reflecting on the question and honestly struggling for a moment. Again, like, have I really seen success in this? And that's really just my sensibility that we've never arrived and there's always work. So I'm gonna try to bring it down a notch. What I feel like I've observed, when I go back and I think about where have I seen change, either perceived change in advocacy and students' response to advocacy, or changes in advocacy that have positively affected students. Anecdotally, again, Asia's point about hiring, I think, is true. Anecdotally, right? I've not researched this, but I would be, and maybe somebody has. In full transparency, I haven't checked this out. Anecdotally, I feel like I observed when there were advocates whose identities aligned with the survivor. So having an advocate who is also a Black woman, and I identify as a Black woman, for example, in my administrator role, I feel like I saw more Black women survivors being willing to go through a formal process, meaning, right, so advocacy is this piece, how can I support you? And that person decides, I feel like I could feel some type of resolution through this formal process, as Asia was saying before. So anecdotally, I want to co-sign that. What's coming up for me additionally around that is we also know that advocates, I have not ever talked to an advocate that said, I feel like I am paid, I'm compensated totally fairly, and I'm allowed to have good boundaries with my work. And so, yes, what Asia said, and don't just go. Don't hear us say, just don't go hiring people and then not pay them the right amount for the work and or provide that support. Because I think that's a tension that we feel. But I have noticed that anecdotally. And then the other piece that I've seen and where we felt successful, maybe more specifically in roles that I've held, is in the policy world, the compliance world, we're trained, your gauge is the policy, so the policy's here and you stay in the policy lane. And for a survivor, for an accused person, right? Who's in a type of process, right? And they're being asked questions, for example, about the um, for a survivor, maybe the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And that survivor is describing their story in words that they would use. And someone in that process doesn't literally just doesn't understand what they're saying. And instead of maybe making a note and looking it up later, we've seen where maybe folks, administrators in my role, might ask a question that seems innocuous to them, but it's really they're not understanding either the like the shorthand or the colloquialism or culturally how someone is speaking. So again, to Asia's point, we're not just talking about language interpretation, but also someone who can hear your story. And so I think for administrators, what I've seen that's successful, again, it's not just, we're not just talking about a training on, having all Title IX investigators do a training on inclusiveness. It's how are we really working with our staff on sort of an administrative side of advocacy, and when we're interacting with survivors, that we feel comfortable and confident going into hearing someone's story and not getting hung up on kind of, Asia might lean on you for an example that's appropriate. Like I'll put an easy one out there. As I get older, there's something like I have to Google a lot of stuff. Like Riz, I know it means charisma, but I had to look it up. But I remember a student said that to me, and I was like, I'm not going to ask them what that means right now, because the context in which they were sharing it with me, we weren't just chatting. It was something had happened, and I had no idea what that meant, and I went and looked it up. And so that's what I mean. Like, we're not understanding something, and so then we're putting the responsibility, as Asia mentioned earlier, again, on the survivor or the person affected in our process to explain something to us that has nothing to do with what we should actually be asking about. And that can cause further harm. And so I've seen attention to those pieces be, I guess, successful. I don't know if I'd say it was successful. I think it made maybe a process a little less hurtful.
I really appreciate what you all are saying about what I hear an underlying of harm reduction. Like a lot of times, this terrible, life changing thing has happened that people need external support for and advocacy. But how do we reduce the amount of future harm that is happening? And how do we reduce the harm that right now, in the process of us going through the policy, through the interpersonal pieces, through the intrapersonal pieces, reducing that? And so I would love if you all could share a little bit about where do you start to learn this training? So I'll share a practice. I worked in Res Life for about a decade. And one of the things that we have happen in our residence hall sometimes is interpersonal violence. And so at UNCG, which I love so dearly, I think a lot of us have a connection to that beautiful place, is not having to have a victim tell their story multiple times, right? And so we go to conferences, we learn about that from NASPA and our knowledge communities. But where does someone start that's maybe not in this field or maybe works in finance or on the law side? Like, where do you start learning about tools that you can do to treat people like better humans and to help victims? So is there a professional association? Does your university or your place of employment have like a guide? Do you know a best practice manual? What can people kind of dig into to learn on their own? And either of you can go.
I was about to say, I think immediately I thought, I was like, well, the person's gonna have to want to do that first, right? They're gonna have to want to be a good person, and that can be tricky. And I think we all can talk about how we've had conversations with folks about like either what we do, um, our passion projects, things that we stand for, where they're just not getting it right. And so, luckily, the national nonprofit that I work for, NOVA, so National Organization for Victim Advocacy, is what I like to tell my higher ed folks is that it is the NASPA ACPA of victim advocacy. And so I specifically work on a culturally specific grant where I work with the Office on Violence Against Women campus grantees on how to make sure that their interventions for domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking are more culturally specific and include specific student populations and micro communities. So not only thinking about race, gender, sexual orientation, gender expression, etc., but also thinking about student athletes, Greek life. How do we engage these very specific populations that we kind of need a little gateway into, right? We need to tailor the information so that it fits what they're dealing with or the things that they see within their culture, right? And so we have various toolkits on working with the different populations. We just launched the Communicating Access interactive airplane toolkit, along with not Survivor Fund Hub, who was it? Activating Change. And we were working, or excuse me, not Activating Change, Spare Mind, Zoe Collins. And it was an interactive paper airplane resource where we are trying to help students with disabilities communicate their access needs if they have been, or if they are a survivor of some sort of violence, right? And so that's something that's very useful for practitioners to use within the moment, right? We also have toolkits on how to engage with military connected student survivors who are a part of the LGBTQIA plus spectrum. And we're always working on new resources. We have the podcast, which is hosted by yours truly. So if you want to continue to hear me talk with some of our lovely guests, we have podcast episodes that we are launching. And so I'll make sure that y'all have the website to look at some of the resources that we have. But we also have training academies that do a basic 40-hour victim advocacy training. We have crisis response training, and those really get into, you know, the foundational aspects that Lee was talking about of how to be a decent person and how to show up and how to have these conversations, or just some of that foundational basic knowledge that is needed in order to advocate for someone. I think a lot of times we talk about bystander intervention, right? And so we have resources for bystander intervention. We're able to connect with other partners to talk about HBCU specific bystander intervention. And so we have access to all of those resources. And so I'll be sure that y'all are able to find the information in order to find those resources to help you out.
Thank you all so much. Asia, before we get over to Megan, we just want to give people opportunity. If you have a comment or something that Asia said or something that Megan is about to say resonates with you, drop us a comment, friends. We would love to hear. And thank you so much. And we'll pass it over to Megan.
Yeah, I always struggle with what to do next, in large part because I hope and I want the what to do next to be really individualized. This work, and I think anytime you're engaging, I think with a human, and then a human who's experienced violence, I believe and hope that we all have there's something within us that says, I as a person really want to understand and to do my best to stop the harm and minimally not play a role in making anything worse. And I say that through the lens of, in the trainings that I host, I get asked all the time, well, what do I do when someone comes to me and they don't know that I'm required to report it to you? How do I stop them from telling me their story? Because what I see and experience, or see others experiencing, is a real fear of breaking someone's trust, but they also want to follow the rules. And so the motivation, right, in my mind at that point is around rule following to do the right thing versus just being a person with another person. And so when I think about how can I be the best person with another person, what do I need to feel like I have the right the best tools for me to be able to support someone who may have experienced, in this case, sexual violence. One, if I didn't know a lot about the topic, thinking about the ideas and the resources that Asia just provided are wonderful. If you are on a college campus or within a nonprofit with a close proximity to a college campus or can access Nova, within those campuses, there are probably people who are hosting programs and trainings that you can attend to learn more about survivor experiences on your campus or nearby. So I think just a sense of, how is your campus feeling about how other people on campus are responding to them? And the other piece that I, as a person in this work, have lived by is, again, there's so much pressure to, we have to make this report, or I will get in trouble if I don't make the report, that we lose sight of the person in front of us. And if the person in front of you is telling you, and I want to connect back to something Asia said earlier, I don't care if they're laughing, I don't care if they're crying, I don't care if they're shaking or telling jokes. If they are telling you that they have had an experience, that they have been hurt, that they have experienced violence, if they are telling you those words, tell them that you believe them and go from there, right? Think about yourself in a situation where you might be vulnerable. And I know this all sounds really simple. And I hope no one feels as though I'm talking down to anyone. And that's not the intention. I think in what I've seen in those moments, and I imagine Asia has heard of them from some of the folks that she's worked with, in those moments, I think it's one of the moments where we assume that we're going to know exactly what to say. But it's tough when you're in it. Practice it in your car, right? Use the resources, listen to the podcast, say something out loud to yourself on your walk or in the car ride about how you might respond. Because that first point of contact that someone has is so valuable in terms of the resources that they'll continue to get. And then if you're like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to learn all of the things. There's so much good work being done, of course, in the higher ed field and with research. Asia probably knows I'm going to mention this because I can't not do it. And that's, there's some work being done by Nadika Kunrante and Chris Linder. And they have just finished a book with a colleague who I apologize, whose name escapes me because I haven't met them yet, but on abolitionist approaches to sexual violence. And there's some really helpful, like actual tools and reflection points in there. It's a pretty short book that you can kind of pick up. There's also one that Chris Linder wrote called Sexual Violence on Campus, and kind of bringing in that historical lens that Asia talked about. Those, for me, even as someone who'd been in the field for a while of doing this work and hearing stories, those were two really helpful pieces for me to kind of put into words and into practice how to hold all of these different elements of someone's experience, but also my responsibility as an administrator, and kind of bring that to and challenge me as a white woman in this work, to be honest. If you're ready to get pushed a little bit, pick up one of those books. And there are several others that if you're ready if you're like, I'm in it and I'm ready to get called out, there's some other folks too that are willing to bring you along. So sit with people and then read and hear people's stories.
Thank you both. I want to just note the fact that we have some folks who are logged in with us today who have just made some comments along the way. Most recently, Dr. Mueller kind of hearted, saying, I believe you, and bearing witness to somebody else's life experience is really huge and a way to honor them as a human being. And then earlier we had Jordan and Duntrail both saying, looking forward to this. Thank you for being here. And so I just want you to know there are people out there who are listening and offering you all appreciation. If anybody else has questions or thoughts, I know we're coming toward the close, but we still have some time. So please don't hesitate to add your questions in the comment section on LinkedIn. As you two were talking, I was thinking about things that people can do who are not like in direct victim or survivor serving roles, like for example bystander interventions that encourage people, like if you're someplace where you see somebody being treated in a way that seems to like violate their autonomy or that they're resisting, like that there are things that we can all do to help create safer spaces and situations and communities, and then that hopefully then reduces some of the load that comes toward folks like Asia and Megan, because I'm also like mindful of burnout as something that happens quite often in this field. And, you know, just hearing the integrity and the caring with which you both conduct your work, I know that taking care of yourself at the same time is also really important and not always easy. So I just want to also like give you all heartfelt appreciation for everything that you're doing to help people on their journey to just becoming whole again after something, you know, very traumatic has happened to them. Um, are there any other kind of ways that you would encourage us to think about creating like safe as possible or supportive spaces? So whether that's like in our communities, on our campuses, in places where we work or learn or live. So any just kind of last thoughts about what we can all do as members of our community to try to promote safety and respectful interactions. Either one of you can take that.
Okay. I know one of the things that I've seen within like the campus community is that some professors might put like a statement for advocacy on their syllabi. So, you know, students know the resources that are available. And that can sometimes signal to the student, okay, so if this is on their syllabi, like this is somebody that I can come talk to about what has happened to me or what I've experienced. And we've seen that be beneficial when folks are trying to figure out who to talk to without like straight up going to dean of students or going to Title IX, just because sometimes they just need a sounding board, right? One of the things that is not as easily tangible, but something that I will always stand like 10 toes for is having some sort of confidential advocate or support person on campus, so that students can feel like, okay, I can go talk to this person about what happened and I don't have to make a move unless I want to. Because like I said, a lot of people just need sounding boards for right now. And I think that, you know, on the outside looking in, when not doing this work, that I believe you goes a really long way. Like when Megan was talking about kind of like the language that we're using to talk to folks who have been victimized by violence, saying I believe you, mirroring their language, allowing them the space to be what they need to be at that time, whether it's angry, sad, frustrated, numb, or nothing, like that goes a long way. Because I think the thing with bystander intervention is, yes, if I see someone like getting into it in the street, I can walk up on you, you know what I'm saying? But like now I might put myself in harm's way, right? So we have to be careful there. So I think being able to hold space for the individual without projecting what we feel like they should be doing or how we feel like they should be responding, similar to what Megan said earlier, is going to be very important and is probably one of the easiest, in air quotes, things that you can do as a bystander, right? If you are seeing a situation that you feel like you can intervene in physically, maybe just going to stand beside the person and asking them directly, hey, are you okay? Do you need anything from me right now? Right now, again, you got to assess it, right? We need to make sure that you're still safe in that situation. But when we're thinking about a campus context and we're thinking about that higher ed experience, being able to hold space is going to go so far and be so important. And that's how true connections form, because I might not know the first thing about Megan, don't know nothing about her title. Actually, I should be calling her Dr. Carbly. But anyways, I might not be knowing nothing, you know what I'm saying? I don't know her from a can of paint, as my grandma would say. But if something just happened to me and she's the first staff person that I saw and I just felt like I could talk to them, and Megan gave me the space to do so, and to make have the moment to have like a little dark sense of humor about what's going on in this, that, and the third. Now I've established an organic connection with this person on my campus, and now I know that I can go to her for support, and I can feel like, okay, if Megan tells me like about these resources, I trust her enough that she's not going to send me to a resource that's going to further harm me. Now, granted, that can be a lot to hold, right? Because Megan has no control over how the resources work on campus, right? But I think for me, when I was a student navigating some issues just in general, when you find someone that allows you to be authentically who you are, in a moment of stress, vulnerability, and all of that, is it very helpful to have that person on campus that allows you to hold that space, and to know that like they have your best interest in mind. And so that makes it easier. That makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, I would add to that. Make it manageable for you. I loved Asia's suggestion of the syllabus language, and I think, and even in my own experience, when I'm maybe in an uncomfortable spot, or I'm feeling unsafe, or I've experienced a lack of safety, or I've been harmed, in each of those, I I immediately look for, and I think our intuition is to look for, am I safe? Am I okay now? Is the place that I'm in good for me, right? And our students, our communities do that, right? They come into our offices, they come into our classrooms, they come into wherever we're providing that direct service, and people are looking around, right? Think for yourself when you go into a new place, or maybe you're even interviewing for a job. You're looking for hints. What kind of situation? What's around here? And trying to take in some of those cues. So make it simple. Is there a way, if you have your LinkedIn profile, or within your role, where you're working or providing support, is there a way that you can signal, if you don't have this, if you're not a syllabus person, you're not teaching, how can you signal that you invite the whole person, including if they've experienced harm? How can you signal to someone who maybe has experienced violence on the basis of their sexual orientation, their race, gender, etc.? How can you signal to them that you are willing to hold space for them? And then, as Asia said, making sure that you know that you have support to back up when, okay, thank you, I'm really glad that you came to me. I know Asia, she works over in this building. I think she'd be a great next step. Do you want me to go with you, or let's see if we can get her on the phone, right? Sending those signals doesn't mean you have to be the person, but I think sending the signals and then being able, then taking the steps to back them up with, how would you support someone? So start small. It adds up. You may not be able to change the policy immediately, but you surely can provide a space where folks see themselves reflected in both your working space and the spaces that you show up in.
Thank you all so much for your beautiful response. There's a lot happening right now in the world, on your campus, potentially in your home, and potentially within your own soul and your mind and your spirit. We're all fighting a silent battle, may it be mental health, physical health, or just missing a loved one who's no longer here. So, in order to do that, we just want to take a moment to observe a moment of silence together before we close out the show. Thank you all so much for your time. So, before we close out the show today, we invite you to drop any questions and answers into the chat. We would love to answer them now or later. If you yourself work in victim advocacy work or just human support and human services, please drop any resources. May it be a professional organization, may it be a TED Talk, may it be Asia's podcast. But we would love to hear from you in the chat. So, we had a great time with you all today. Where can people connect with you, find you, learn more about what you're doing, and what are you doing outside of this, friends? And we'll start over with Asia, and then we'll go over to Megan.
Ugh, I knew it was gonna be me first. So I don't have a professional Instagram really. I like to read. So if you're interested in some of the books Megan has talked about, because Megan be putting me on. If you're interested in some of the things that I read just in general, you can follow me at Nappy Reads on Instagram. That's my little public page where I talk about reading and I tell y'all the books that I'm reading, and I'm very dramatic about how the plot twists are with what I'm reading. But if you are interested in the specific work that I do with Nova, head on over to trynova.org. That's TRYNOVA.org. And you'll go to the initiatives and you'll scroll down to culturally specific. And that's where you'll find all of the wonderful things that I'm doing, including the podcast, including our public toolkits to work with specific student populations.
I also don't have a professional social media outside of LinkedIn because work is hard. But I do have, similar to Asia, a bit of an external outlet that I enjoy sharing some of the lessons learned in my work with others in a little bit more of a fun way. I'm a cycling instructor. And so I do have a public Instagram, Carb Cycling. And so I'll share from time to time some pieces there and causes that I support and try to support through that platform. In terms of projects, I'm working on a project with Chris Linder and Adika Kurunante right now on a research team. And so that's been really rewarding. I've gotten to talk to quite a few folks and hear from folks across the country who are doing this work every single day. And I try to get into the classroom as much as I can when folks invite me to teach in undergrad and graduate programs at my institution and my alma mater. So hopefully we will all cross paths for those of you who are have joined us today on LinkedIn or otherwise, maybe in a cycling class in Greensboro, North Carolina, but no pressure.
We all had an amazing time chatting with you all today. It was absolutely phenomenal. And we invite you all to join us in the Manifesting Inclusion community. This is not owned by anyone except for you. And we would love to have you as a part of this, where we talk about the importance of inclusion. And through this thought about manifesting, which is putting power behind action and being intentional about the future, we hope to manifest a more inclusive world. Dr. G, do you want to leave any comments for Asia or Megan? I know I learned a lot today.
I did too. I just want to say happy Valentine's Day to the ladies on the screen. And thank you to everyone on the call who joined us today.
Thank you all so much for joining. If this is a topic of interest, or you would like to be a guest, or you would just like to know more about the work we do, we invite you to follow us at Manifesting Inclusion. This stream will be available to share, to view right after this here on LinkedIn and also over on YouTube. We look forward to seeing you next week, where Dr. G will be leading us through a conversation talking about Black men's mental health. So it is Black History Month. And in order to in order to think about those ways that those intersections, those specialized populations that we hope to retain, we'll be talking about that next week in an audio session. So we definitely look forward to that. But thank you so much for your time, Megan and Asia. Do you have any words to sign us off at today?
Happy Black History Month. That's all I got.
Ditto.
All right, good people. We hope